Welcome back once more. We're pulling 4chan material tonight that's deeply disturbing. The kind that's dark and twisted. Like the video, subscribe, lights off, and we're going. In November 2022, I rented a small cabin in the woods outside of Stowe, Vermont to finish my dissertation. I picked the place because I needed somewhere quiet. My apartment near campus was too loud, and I was falling behind. The cabin was about 15 minutes from Route 100, down a narrow dirt road that disappeared between pine trees. The listing called it a private mountain retreat, which was a little generous. It was an old one-bedroom house with faded green siding, a wood stove, and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. Still, it had internet, a desk, and enough space for me to work. That was all I cared about. The owner, a woman named Sarah, met me there on a cold afternoon and showed me around. She explained how to use the stove and pointed out the outdoor faucet near the side of the house. "Don't leave that running," she said. "The pipes are old, they freeze fast." I laughed because I thought she was making a normal cabin owner joke. I had no idea that faucet would be the first thing that made me consider leaving. For the first few days, everything was exactly what I wanted. I worked at the desk during the day, walked around the property in the evenings, and cooked simple meals. The woods were quiet in a way I wasn't used to. At night, I could hear branches tapping against the roof and the occasional sound of trucks far away on the highway. The first strange thing happened on my fourth night. I woke up because I heard water outside. At first I assumed it was rain, then I noticed the sound was too steady. I walked to the kitchen window and saw the outdoor faucet was on. A thin stream of water was hitting the frozen ground below it. I put on my boots and went outside. The air smelled like wet leaves and smoke from the chimney. The faucet handle was turned all the way open. I was annoyed more than scared. I figured I had bumped it while bringing in firewood earlier. I shut it off and went back inside. The next morning, the little wooden gate at the end of the driveway was open. I knew I had closed it. I remembered pulling it shut after getting the mail because the latch was stiff and I had to lift it slightly. Again, I found an easy explanation. Maybe the wind opened it. Maybe I had been tired and forgot. The weather in Vermont changes quickly, and I was spending long hours reading. That night, I heard footsteps, not on the porch, around the house. Slow footsteps on frozen dirt. I turned off my desk lamp and waited. I stayed away from the windows because I didn't want anyone outside to see me standing there. After a few minutes, the steps stopped. I looked through the corner of the kitchen window. Nobody was there. The next day, I drove into Stowe and stopped at a small grocery store. I mentioned the gate to the cashier, mostly as a joke. An older man behind me heard it and asked where I was staying. When I told him the road name, he got quiet. "You rented the old Hale place?" I said I thought so. He nodded. "There are a few old hunting paths back there. People cut through those woods sometimes." That explanation actually made me feel better. A random person walking through the area made more sense than anything else. I bought a cheap motion light at a hardware store and installed it near the porch. I also moved a chair in front of the basement door because I noticed the lock on it wasn't great. That night, nothing happened. The night after that, the faucet was on again. The gate was open again. And when I checked the motion light in the morning, it was turned toward the ground. Someone had moved it. I called Sarah. She sounded surprised. "Nobody should be near that property," she said. "The closest neighbor is almost half a mile away." Could someone be using the old trails? There was a pause. "Maybe. There used to be a guy who hunted around there. His name was Mark. I don't know if he still lives nearby." I asked if she had his number. She said no. I started noticing things I had ignored before. Small things. The basement door was never fully closed in the morning. A few pieces of firewood were moved from the stack outside. Once I found muddy marks near the back steps, but they stopped before reaching the porch. That was the part that bothered me. Whoever was doing it was coming close enough to touch the house, but not close enough to look inside. A few nights later, I was working at my desk when the porch light went dark. The bulb was fine. I had checked it that morning. I sat there for a while, listening. Then I saw the beam of a flashlight through the trees. It wasn't moving randomly. It was moving with me. I stood up from the desk. The light shifted. I walked to the kitchen. The light shifted again. I stepped toward the hallway. The beam followed. I froze. The person outside wasn't searching for me. They were watching where I was inside the house. I grabbed my phone and recorded a short video from behind the wall. I didn't want to go near the windows. The flashlight disappeared after a minute. I called the local police department. An officer named Ben came by about 40 minutes later. He walked around the property with a flashlight and looked at the tracks near the side of the house. "Could be someone messing around," he said. "I'll check the area tomorrow." Before he left, he looked toward the tree line. "You know there used to be a hunting cabin somewhere back there?" I asked about Mark. Ben looked at me. "Yeah, he lives farther down the road." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, fresh snow started falling. It was the first real snowfall of the season, covering the ground behind the cabin with a clean white layer. That was when I saw the tracks. They weren't coming from the neighbor's property. They started beside the old stone well, about 30 yards behind the house. I had seen that well before. It was covered with boards and half hidden by brush. I assumed it was just an abandoned thing from when the property was built. The tracks came out from behind it. I followed them with my eyes. They went straight to the side of the cabin. I called Ben again. This time he arrived faster. He removed the boards from the well opening and looked down. There was no water. The bottom was dry. There was an opening in the stone wall, a narrow passage. The flashlight from his hand disappeared into it. "Stay back," he said. A few minutes later, he came out and called for another unit. The passage ran under the property. It connected to a section of the old foundation beneath the house. There were places where someone could stand and hear movement upstairs. The police found evidence that someone had been using it recently. They also found an entrance hidden farther into the woods near an old hunting trail. While they searched, I sat in my car at the edge of the road and watched officers move around the property. The snow kept falling, covering the tire marks and footprints from everyone who came after. Ben came over after a while and told me they had found the route into the passage. It started near an old trail that wasn't marked on any modern maps. He said the entrance had probably been there for years. "Someone knew about it," he said. I asked him if Mark had built it. Ben didn't answer. That was the first time I realized he probably already knew more than he was telling me. Mark was the neighbor Sarah had mentioned. I never saw him that night, but the police found him near the road a few hours after they searched the area. I don't know what he planned to do. Nobody told me much after that. I left before sunset. I packed my things into my car and kept the lights on inside the cabin. I left the bedroom lamp burning because I wanted anyone outside to think I was still there. Then I climbed out through the basement window. I waited behind the shed and watched. About 20 minutes later, someone came through the trees. It was Mark. He walked straight to the house, he opened the door and went inside. I ran to the front, shut the door behind him, and locked it from the outside. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the key once. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I walked down the dirt road until I reached the highway and flagged down the first car that passed. The cabin was empty when the police checked it again later. Under the old well, they found a dry service passage connected to the original foundation. That was how he had been getting close to the house without leaving tracks near the driveway. I drove out to a farm in western Kansas to pick up a trailer full of old radio equipment that was supposed to be worth almost nothing in January 2014. I was buying and selling old communications gear at the time. Mostly police scanners, CB radios, antennas, old ham equipment. Nothing glamorous. I found listings on Craigslist, drove out, checked the stuff, and either fixed it or sold it online. The farm was about 20 minutes outside a small town near the Colorado border. I remember the roads because there was nothing around them, flat fields, dead grass, a few lines of trees near houses. The kind of place where you can see a truck coming from miles away. The seller was a woman named Ruth. She was probably in her late 60s. She met me at the end of a gravel driveway, wearing a thick brown coat and holding a coffee mug with both hands. "You the guy for the radios?" she asked. I nodded and told her I was. "Good. I don't want them sitting in that barn anymore." The barn was behind the house. The door stuck when she opened it, and she had to pull hard enough that the metal frame shook. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and gasoline from some farm equipment parked in the back. The radio equipment belonged to her husband, a man named Frank. She said he had been into radio since before they were married. He built antennas, listened to weather reports, talked to truckers, all that kind of stuff. He kept everything, Ruth said. You could throw away a broken chair, and he would ask where the screws went. I laughed because it sounded familiar. Anyone who collects old electronics knows that type of person. The first hour was normal. I tested a few receivers with my truck battery and checked the condition of the parts. Most of it was outdated. Some of the knobs were cracked. A few cables had green corrosion around the ends. Near the back of the barn, I found a large receiver sitting on a wooden shelf. It was an older model, probably from the 70s. Heavy metal case, lots of switches, a scratched glass display. Ruth noticed me looking at it. "That one stays," she said. I asked if it worked. She looked at it for a second longer than I expected. It did when Frank was alive. I figured she meant she did not want to sell something sentimental. I told her that was fine and moved on. A little later, while I was loading boxes, I heard static coming from the receiver. I turned around. The old radio was still on the shelf. I had not plugged it in. I walked over and saw a small portable battery pack connected behind it. I had missed it because it was covered by a pile of cables. The display showed a frequency I did not recognize. I adjusted the volume, expecting random noise. Instead, I heard voices. At first, it sounded like regular radio traffic, short messages, numbers, locations. I assumed it was some kind of old utility channel that was still active. Then I heard a man say, "The place south of County Road 8, single woman, red pickup, leaves around 9 most mornings." I stopped moving. There was a pause, then another voice replied, "How far from town?" "About 12 miles. I looked at Ruth. She was standing near the barn door. "Is this still something people use?" I asked. She did not answer right away. "Turn it off." Her voice was quiet. I turned the knob. The speaker went silent. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. I remember hearing the wind pushing against the barn walls. The smell of coffee from Ruth's mug was still in the air. I tried to make it less strange. "Could be old recordings," I said. "Some radios can pick up weird stuff if the frequency is wrong." Ruth kept looking at the receiver. "No." That was all she said. I asked what she meant. She walked closer and touched the side of the radio. "Frank found that channel 2 months before he died." I thought she meant he had found some local radio group. Maybe people talking privately, maybe he got curious and listened. But then she said something that made me stop. "He heard our address." I waited for her to explain. She told me Frank started acting different after finding the frequency. He would sit in his truck at night with the radio on. He wrote things down on old receipts and pieces of paper. Ruth thought he was just chasing some strange radio signal. Then one evening he heard a voice mention their farm. The voice said their road name. A few days later, Frank died when his truck went off a dirt road near the property. The official report said it was an accident. I looked through the barn window toward the driveway. Her old truck was parked beside the house. "You think those people caused it?" I asked. Ruth shook her head. "I don't know what I think." That answer bothered me more than if she had said yes. I should have left right then. I know that sounds obvious, but standing there in that barn, I still had a dozen reasons not to. I had driven almost 3 hours. I had already spent money on the equipment. The radio could have been picking up something harmless. That was the part I kept coming back to. There was always a normal explanation. I finished loading the equipment. Ruth watched me the entire time. Before I left, I asked if she wanted me to take the old receiver too. No. She looked toward the house. Frank kept it for a reason. I drove back to my place that night with a truck full of radios and a feeling that I had made a mistake by taking anything from that barn. 2 days later, I decided to test the equipment properly. I had forgotten about the old receiver until I saw it under a blanket in my garage. I connected it to an antenna and turned it on. The same frequency came through. There was no static this time, just voices. The first thing I heard was my own location. Not my address. They did not have that. They were talking about Ruth's farm. "The old woman is still there," a different voice said. "She won't be there long." I grabbed the volume knob. Then someone said, "The buyer already came." I froze. "The radio guy?" "Yeah." A few seconds passed. "Does he have it?" "He took the equipment." I turned the radio off. I sat in my garage for a long time without moving. The next morning, I called Ruth. She answered after a few rings. "Did you hear it?" she asked. I did not ask how she knew. I told her what happened. She was silent. Then she said, "Get rid of that thing." I told her I would bring it back. "No." The way she said it made me stop. "Do not bring it here." I drove out anyway. I know that was stupid. I had convinced myself I needed to warn her in person. I also wanted to know if there was something else going on. Maybe she had neighbors messing with her. Maybe there was an explanation. When I arrived, Ruth was already outside. She had packed a small bag. "Take me to my sister's house," she said. I looked at the farmhouse. "What's happening?" She pointed at the radio equipment in my truck bed. That was how they picked places. I asked what she meant. She told me Frank had figured it out. The people on the frequency were not just talking about random houses. They talked about who lived alone, who had dogs, who had weapons when people went into town. They were choosing. Before I could answer, the radio inside my truck turned on. I had not connected it. The speaker crackled. A man's voice came through. The buyer came back. Ruth went pale. Then another voice said, "He has the woman with him." I looked at Ruth. The radio kept going. "Truck is leaving soon." I grabbed the receiver and ripped the power cable out. Nothing happened. The speaker stayed on. Then I heard my own truck mentioned. I did not wait around to understand it. I helped Ruth get into the passenger seat, threw the radio equipment onto the ground, and drove. As we reached the county road, I saw headlights behind us. A car was following. No lights, just the shape of it moving in the dark. I sped up. The car stayed behind us, but it never got closer. Ruth sat quietly, with her hands folded in her lap. After about 10 minutes, she said, "They know where we are going." I looked in the mirror. The car was still there. Then we turned onto the highway, and a few minutes later it disappeared. I took Ruth to her neighbor's first, then to her sister's place the next morning. I never went back for the equipment. A few weeks later, I heard what happened to the farm. Someone broke into the property that night. The house and barn were burned. The police said they found no one responsible. The strangest part came months later. Ruth called me. She asked if I still had the old receiver. I told her no. She said she knew. The receiver had been found inside Frank's truck, the truck that had been sitting behind the house for years, the truck with no engine, the one parked near the family cemetery where they buried him. She said the radio was sitting on the driver's seat, still tuned to the same frequency. I used to work the overnight shift in a private biomedical lab near the Ironbound in Newark, a few blocks from the Passaic River. June of 2021 was still full of masks, temperature checks, and half-empty parking lots. Most nights I saw more delivery trucks than people. The building had 4 floors, but after midnight only 2 of us were usually inside. Me, running equipment checks and logging freezer temperatures, and Roy, the security guard who spent most of his shift watching cameras downstairs. The place wasn't exciting. Most alarms turned out to be someone leaving a storage door cracked open before going home. My job was basically making sure expensive samples stayed frozen and that automated reports matched what the sensors recorded. Around 2:17 a.m., my workstation chimed. Freezer Vault C accessed. That wasn't strange by itself. The next line was, "Credential accepted, Evan." I stared at the screen for a second because Evan had been fired about a month earlier. Everyone knew it. His badge should have been disabled the same afternoon. HR was strict about that. I assumed the database hadn't updated after an audit, or maybe someone borrowed an old access profile while testing software. Stuff like that happened more often than people think. Still, procedure said I had to verify every unexpected access. I called downstairs. "Roy, you got anyone coming in?" He answered after a few seconds. "No deliveries. Nobody signed in." "The system says Vault C just opened." Silence. Then he said, "Probably another software glitch." His voice sounded flat, like he was distracted. I grabbed my tablet and headed downstairs anyway. Vault C sat behind 2 security doors in the basement. The hallway always smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with cold metal from the refrigeration units. The air conditioning stayed so low that my hands usually felt dry after a few minutes. The outer door was unlocked. That surprised me more than the alert. Normally, it locked itself after every entry. Inside, the lights were already on. I didn't hear anyone, just the steady hum of compressors. The badge reader beside the freezer still showed a green light. I tapped my own card and opened the heavy, insulated door. Freezer C wasn't one huge room. It was a maze of shelves with rolling racks. Frost covered the corners where the fans couldn't reach. My breath showed immediately. I expected to find sample containers. Instead, I saw 3 plastic storage bins sitting on the floor. No labels, no inventory tags. That alone violated enough rules to get somebody suspended. I opened the first bin. Clothes, men's shirts, women's jackets, jeans folded into stacks. Some still smelled faintly like detergent instead of chemicals. The second bin had wallets, phones, keys, watches. At least 8 phones from what I could tell. Old iPhones, a Samsung, 1 cracked Motorola. Every battery was dead. The third bin made me stop. Passports, driver's licenses. Folders with insurance cards. 1 envelope full of birth certificates sealed inside freezer bags. None of it belonged in our lab. I picked up a New Jersey driver's license. The expiration date was current. The owner looked around 40. I recognized the face, not personally, from a local news story. A missing accountant from Elizabeth. I remembered seeing his picture on Channel 7 weeks earlier while eating dinner before work. I checked another ID, different person, another missing adult. I felt cold for a reason that had nothing to do with the freezer. I backed out and called Roy again. "You need to come down here." "What did you find?" "People stuff. IDs, phones, missing people." "Nothing." Then I heard him breathe into the radio. Stay where you are." "I already am." "I'm coming." He never came. Instead, every electronic lock around me clicked, not opening, closing. The sound echoed through the hallway. My tablet immediately lost network connection. I walked to the main basement door. Locked. I swiped my badge. Red light. Again. Nothing. I hit the call button beside the door. No answer. Then the ceiling speaker crackled. Roy's voice came through. "You weren't supposed to open that freezer." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. "What are you talking about?" "You should have logged the alert and left." "I found evidence." "I know." My stomach tightened. "You need to unlock this." "I'm sorry." The speaker clicked off. I kept pressing the button. No response. I called his cell. Straight to voicemail. The basement suddenly felt much smaller. I tried the emergency exit. Locked too. Whoever programmed the security system had tied emergency lockdown into almost every electronic door. I went back into the freezer because it was the only place with another phone jack mounted on the wall. Dead. No dial tone. While checking behind one of the racks, I noticed fresh scrape marks across the floor. Not old damage. The marks led toward the back wall. There was another insulated door hidden behind stacked containers. I had worked there almost 2 years. I never knew it existed. It opened into a loading bay barely larger than a garage. There wasn't much inside except empty pallets and tire tracks melted into the concrete. The loading door led outside, but thick steel bars had been installed across it from the exterior. Someone had planned that. I heard footsteps overhead. Slow, heavy. Not Roy's usual pace. They crossed the ceiling above me and stopped. Then, another sound. A ventilation fan started. At first, I ignored it. 30 seconds later, I noticed a faint smell. Not smoke. Something sweet. Chemical. I recognized it because we'd practiced emergency procedures every 6 months. The fire suppression system. This version didn't spray water into sensitive storage rooms. It flooded certain sections with gas, enough to force evacuation, enough to make staying inside dangerous. I ran back into the hallway. The vents had already opened. White vapor drifted near the ceiling. The alarm hadn't sounded. Whoever activated it skipped the normal sequence. I yelled into the intercom. "Roy!" No answer. I remember the emergency escape map posted near the freight elevator. There was one manual exit, only one. A rescue window designed for firefighters. Nobody ever used it because it overlooked the roof of the neighboring warehouse instead of the ground. I sprinted toward it. The gas smell grew stronger. My throat started burning. The rescue window had a red hammer hanging beside it behind a plastic cover. I smashed the cover, hit the glass once. Nothing. Twice. The corner shattered. Cold night air rushed inside. I kicked the remaining glass loose and climbed through. The gap was awkward because the window sat almost chest high. For 1 second, I thought I was going to slip. Then I dropped onto the neighboring roof. It wasn't a long fall, maybe 6 feet. My knees hurt anyway. I crawled away from the opening and looked back. White gas continued spilling from the broken window. Nobody appeared. No alarms. Just compressors humming somewhere inside the building. I called 911 from my personal phone. This time I had a signal. Police arrived fast because I kept repeating that people might be trapped inside a secured laboratory. By sunrise, the building was surrounded. Investigators pulled what they could from the freezer before the room was declared contaminated by the suppression discharge. A lot of paper had been soaked. Several phones never powered on again. Roy was gone. His patrol car was still parked outside. His locker still had his jacket hanging inside. Nobody could find him. Later that afternoon, detectives asked me about the badge belonging to Evan. I figured they were asking because somebody cloned it. They weren't. Security footage showed Evan entering the loading bay after midnight several times during the 2 weeks after his official termination. The timestamps matched his old credential perfectly. According to payroll records, he wasn't employed anymore. According to building access logs, he kept coming back. The police went to his apartment. They found him dead inside. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him for days. Nobody could explain how cameras kept recording him at the laboratory after that. As far as I know, Roy disappeared before anyone managed to question him. His phone never connected to another tower again. The investigation stayed open for a long time, but every update became shorter than the last. Eventually, the lab changed ownership, the building got a new logo, and the basement was remodeled. The rescue window I climbed through was sealed with concrete. I know because I drove past months later and looked up at the wall where it used to be. There wasn't even a frame left. That's where we pull back and try to remember what normal feels like. You've got my genuine thanks for staying until the absolute end. What story is going to follow you home tonight? Tell me in the comments. There's a whole archive of darkness waiting. Don't turn off the lights. See you soon.